Hey folks, this is Cindy. Thanks so much for stopping by. I am back to share another card making video with you all, and in today's card we're going to be looking at a couple different things. I haven't done this in ages and I thought it'd be nice to give it a try again and see how I liked it. Now I am going to be focusing on the Simon Says Stamp If the Hat Fits stamp set. This was released for STAMPtember and I'm pretty sure that it's sold out, but you could take any image you'd like and do the same technique and it would work just fine. So I really wanted to still be able to show you this even though this stamp set is no longer available. And this particular stamp set does have a matching die set that goes with it. And I normally don't use them, but for this particular technique, I did. You don't have to, and I'll talk about that here more in a minute. I'm also going to be using one of these circles. This is from the Simon Says Stamp Nested Circle Die set. And you'll also see how I'm going to use that here in a minute. All right, so I took one of those nested circle dies and I used it on a couple of pieces of just scrap cardstock, and then I lightly traced them out on some Ranger watercolor cardstock, and then I can put those aside and save them for later. Now I'm going to use some liquid Frisket. This is by Grumbacher, and an old paintbrush, and I'm going to trace around the outer edge of each of those circles. Now you could stop here. You could do your watercolor, stop here, and stamp one of those images, die cut it out, pop it on top of it, and you would still get the same exact effect of what I'm doing here today. But I wanted to take it a step further. So after I get these circles done, I have one more thing I need to do. Now, if you don't have the dies to whatever image you would like to use, you can stamp that on a piece of paper and just fussy cut it out. Dies make it a little bit easier, but it's still doable even without them. So I'm taking one of those dies, one of the hats in the die set, and I have that cut out, and I'm just laying it on top of my circle. I want it to go a little bit over, a little bit on the inside of the circle, a little bit on the outside of the circle, and I only need to trace everything that's inside the circle. And then I'm going to take the liquid Frisket again and fill all that in and set it to the side so we can set for a minute. So my watercolor of choice today is my Tombow dual brush pens. These are the swatches I have for them. I'll have the names and the numbers of them in the YouTube description below, as well as over on my blog if you're interested. I was going to do 3 cards today. 2 of them met an untimely demise, so you only get to see one. Anyway, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the lightest color out of my 3 Tombow pens, and I'm just literally scribbling on the upper portion of this circle. It's not fancy, it's not pretty, I'm just scribbling it on there. And then I'm going to take the darker color and put that on the bottom. It's the same thing, just scribbling it on there. And then I'm going to take the mid color and put that in the middle, and I'm making the middle color a little bit wider than the other 2 to begin with, because I'm going to bring the lightest and the darkest up and down to meet those colors. You can see what I'm doing right there. I'm mixing them in. Now, the really wonderful thing about Tombow dual brush pens is they mix beautifully. The blending ability of these are just off the hook. So before I even get it wet, I like to make sure that I mix them well, and then they blend that much better as soon as they're wet. Now, I have an old paintbrush of mine. I have no idea what brand it is. I've had it for a billion years, but I love it, so I've hung on to it. You can use anything you like, and I have quite a bit of water on my brush. I'm literally sticking it inside my jar of water, and for the most part, barely tapping it off on my paper towel, although maybe I should have done a little bit better job on that purple. And then I'm swiping it across those colors back and forth. And then I'm going to take a damp paper towel that I have sitting next to me, and I'm just picking up all of that is pooled on top of that liquid Frisket. You want to get as much of that off as you can, because we're going to be taking that off here in a little bit, and we don't want it to smear all over our white card panel. So now, right now, I'm just working the colors a little bit. It doesn't take a whole lot of effort. They kind of do it on their own, especially when there's that much water. Now, I feel like that purple is a little too light, so I'm scribbling some of it onto my work surface, and then I'm going to pick it up with a fairly dry brush. And you can't tell because it's going so fast, but I'm kind of tapping it on there at this point. I don't want to swipe anymore. I want to tap it on there. And then I'm going to let this sit and air dry. I don't want to heat set it because I have that liquid frisket on there and heat isn't very good for it. So I'm just letting it sit there to air dry, which it probably sat there for about 2 hours before I got back to it. Now this is what it looks like when everything is dry, and it hasn't dried back a whole lot. Those colors are still bold and vibrant, and I think they're just gorgeous. Now I'm going to take my adhesive eraser, and I will have the name of that also in the description below, as well as over my blog. I cannot think of it off the top of my head, but I'll be sure to leave you that information. And I'm literally pushing up. I'm trying not to lift it as much as possible because I don't want it to tear my paper. So I'm just kind of pushing it out of the way until it balls up. And then when I see that it breaks on its own, then I'll lift up the eraser and peel it off the end of it. That's generally what works best for me. I know that other people have had success using other techniques with other adhesive erasers and such. You do whatever works for you. This is what works for me. So I just want to get everything out of the inside of that hat as well. And there was a tiny bit of bleeding inside the hat. I'm not going to worry about it because you're going to see what we're going to do with that here in just a moment, and nobody's ever going to know. So now I'm taking that stamp and I'm lining it up in the center of that. This is a lot like how you would line it up if it were a die or a die cut rather. I'm doing the same exact thing, and then I'm going to stamp it, inking it up with Simon Says Stamp Intense Black ink. And I do this a couple times because I do want a really crisp, solid impression. This is on watercolor paper. And even though I'm working on the smooth side, it does have a tiny bit of texture in it. And it's just enough that I need to make sure that I've got a really crisp, solid image. So as soon as I get that done, I can take it out of my Misty stamping tool and we are ready to color. Now I'm going to use Copics. You could totally continue on with whatever watercolor you were using, but I really like coloring black things in with my Copic markers. And for those, I'm using C3, C5, C7, and C10. I have seen these hats colored in with the black Copic marker. I gotta be honest, I'm not that brave, especially if I'm coloring on watercolor paper, because it will bleed a little bit. The fibers in watercolor paper don't quite work the same as what they would on, say, Nina cardstock or something like that. So they do have a tendency to bleed outside of the lines, but you can still totally color over the top of it and it works out just fine. So I started with the C3 and I'm immediately going in with the C7. That one is my second to darkest color. I have enough real estate on these that I can do that, and I know that I'm still going to get a good blend. And I'm concentrating the darkest areas where the hat curves or where the hat bends. So you can see the little crook where that hat is bent over at the top. And then there's a dip right in the middle of that brim. So I'm concentrating my darkest area there. And then underneath the hat, of course, there's going to be shading there. But I want to make sure that I'm keeping enough highlight underneath that hat that you get the idea that there's something underneath there and there's some movement. Now I'm going in with the C10. That I'm literally going right over the top of everything I did with the C7, and I'm not bringing it out any further. This is my darkest color. I want it to be my deepest shadow color, and I want it to look just dark enough that you get the idea that this hat is black, but I don't want to make it look like a big blob. So now I'm back with my C7, and this time I'm taking it out just a little bit further than what I had with the C10, and I'm literally coloring all of this in with flicking motions. Regardless of what color I'm using, I am literally flicking it on. I'm trying not to scrub because I don't want to oversaturate this paper because I don't want it to bleed. So flicking, generally it'll get you just enough color on your card panel that it gets the job done, but you're not bleeding all over the place. That was the C5, and now I'm coming back in with the C3, and this is my lightest color. This is my highlight. On most of these areas, I just have a tiny little spot to color in. And then when I was done with this, I didn't I thought that there was just a little too much contrast between my darkest and my C3. So now I brought my C5 back in, and I'm flicking that on again, but I'm barely taking it past what I had already done with the C3, and that's perfect. Now see, I do have a little bit of bleeding here. I got a little excited under there, so I'm taking my colorless blender, and I'm just pushing that color right back up into the inside the stamp line. So now it's time to work on that ribbon. I thought a really good contrasting color for this would be a green, and I seriously considered a yellow green, and I think that that would be beautiful as well. But I decided on this one to try something a little bit different as far as green. So I'm using G14, G17, and G29. Now these are more of a traditional, I don't know, what would you say? Maybe a true like apple red. And I thought that they looked brilliant next to these hot pinks and purples. Now I'm taking the same approach with this as I did with the hat, and I'm just using flicking motions. And I want to kind of concentrate on where some of my highlights are, because some of this bow is wraps around this hat, so it's kind of a round shape. So some of the light is going to hit the outer edges of this bow. So the tip of where that bow is looped there at the top, I want to make sure I keep that light. The center of it where it wraps around the hat, I want to make sure I keep that light so you get the idea of roundness. And then I want to keep some of the tips of those ribbons that are hanging down. I want to keep those light as well. Although they are under the hat, technically they wouldn't need too much highlight. I still wanted them to stand out, and I can get away with adding just a little bit of highlight. It's all flicking. It's really, really easy coloring. There's really nothing to it, and I don't think, usually I'll go back over something twice. I don't think I did with this. It's easy. So I do that white line that goes around it. It is kind of rough. That's fine. It mimics everything else. I am going to fix a little bit of it later because I'm not looking for a crisp line, but I do need to clean some of that up so you get the idea that there's a white outline going around it. Okay, so now I have some Tim Holtz Distress Paint. This is in Black Soot, and I'm just putting a couple drops of it on my acrylic block. And then off screen, I'm taking my water bottle, and I'm putting a little bit of water on it. It's probably 4 or 5 drops of water. I'm trying to be careful that I don't actually hit that ink because I don't want it to splatter all over the place just yet. And I have my card panel tilted at an angle because I want my paint splatters to go diagonally across that panel. And then I realized my mistake. I start flicking that paint on there, and then I'm like, dope, I did not cover that up. And I actually have the best thing ever to cover it up, and that's the die cut I had originally cut out. And it's perfect. It's the perfect shape. So I'm putting that back over the top of it, and then I'm going to load my paintbrush up again, and I'm going to start splattering again. The thing to keep in mind with when you splatter paint is it's all in how you hold your brush. So I have my brush literally perpendicular to my paper. So it's flat. Is that perpendicular or parallel? Whatever. I keep it flat as I flick it, and then I can control it a lot more. And now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to stamp my panel, and I want this sentiment to go right there inside that circle. So I have it loaded up on my MISTI. I have it pinned down with one of my creative corners. These are handy dandy tools, folks. If you don't have them, you should get them. They're pretty amazing. I'm stamping it with Versamark ink because I'm going to heat emboss it with Simon Says Stamp silver embossing powder. This would also look really cool in a gold embossing powder or a white embossing powder. I did try a sample with black, and because of this particular color combination, it was a little too dark. So anything bright that will stand out is perfect. So now that I have that done, I am going to take my EK Success anti-static powder tool over the top of the panel again, and I'm making sure I load this up because I really don't want any stray powder sticking. It'll be totally noticeable on this particular panel because of that watercoloring. So I'm making sure to get that good. And then I'm going to use Versamark ink again. This time I have the stars from the stamp set just simply loaded on an acrylic block, and I'm hand stamping those. I'm just going to do one there at the top, and then I'm going to add my embossing powder, make sure that that's good and shaken off, and I'm making sure that I don't have any strays. Now, some of that paint splatter will hide it, but you'll still see it because that silver will stand out. Now I'm taking that die cut again because I need to use it as a little mask. I want 5 stars on the front of my panel, and I was too lazy to take off the one. So I'm going to use that die as a mask to make sure that I don't get that star on there. And then I'm going to add more embossing powder to that, and then I'm going to heat set the whole thing all over again, and we are actually getting real close to finishing up with this card. It was actually overall pretty easy. Now, I did take the rectangle die from the Simon Says Stamp bundle of stitch shapes, and I did trim down that panel with it. I think the stitching really helps add to this card. And then I have a piece of fun foam and some iCraft adhesive. This is the 1/2 inch. I love this stuff. I use it all the time. This is some of my favorite double-sided adhesive tape. It works beautifully and it stands up well. And I'm just making sure that my card panel is straighter. It got a little warped from all the water and the heat embossing, and the fun foam works out great to help keep that straightened out. So I also have this attached to a Simon Says Stamp black card base. And then for embellishments, you could use anything you'd like. You could even put little gemstones, like black gemstones on this. You could use black sequins on this. Even the crystal clear sequins from Pretty Pink Posh would be gorgeous. I like the Nouveau crystal drops. I think that they look wonderful when they're dry. They smooth out like they're supposed to. They don't have that little dimple on them, but yet they still stay as round as what they should, and they look perfect. I'm also going to add some Spectrum Noir clear overlay pen. I'm only adding this to the highlights. I generally do that when I'm using a glitter pen. I just stick it straight on the highlights, so when the light hits it, it kind of reinforces that there's only a highlight there. Plus, glitter should be on everything as far as I'm concerned. Now, the last thing I'm going to do is take my clear glaze pen. This is by Sakura, and I'm just going to go over the top of only the green on the card. So the green trim on the brim of the hat, as well as all of the green ribbon. It doesn't add too much dimension, so it looks like it's puffing up. Or has any like a dome to it. It's just enough that it helps reinforce that ribbon on there almost looks like a piece of satin, and it looks really cool. You could leave that off. Now, at this point, I'm going to call it a day. Oh, but one last thing. I did take a Uniball Signo white gel pen, and I did touch up that outline around the hat so it looked a little bit more consistent. Outside of that, we are done. We are good to go. Do be sure to head over to my blog for more details and links, as well as subscribe to my YouTube channel so you can see more crafty goodness. And I hope you enjoyed my card today. Thanks so much for stopping by. Until next time.